You know, when I was Jen's campaign manager, there were times where I would recognize that I was, maybe too harsh on some of the people that were on the campaign because I lived and breathed it every day. And sometimes in the moment, you don't necessarily recognize that what you're doing may be a little too rough and tough for some people. And I always make sure to go tell them that, it's not personal. I really appreciate you. I really I want us to win. I want us to make a difference. And I think there's a big difference between working on a campaign with somebody who really believes in the mission and the cause and expects so much of themselves as well as everybody else that they misinterpret that as something other than what it really is. But to take it to the extreme of suggesting that this person is basically a creep and is nefarious in a way, but there's actually no evidence to prove that point, that's a very slippery slope. And it seems like that has become a problem. But Shahid, you are attempting to set precedent now by actually taking this to court and saying, look, for future candidates who are actually in position to potentially win against powerful, entrenched corporate incumbents, I need you to see what's happening right now in San Francisco, because if we are able to have success with our lawsuit, this is going to set precedent for everybody else around the country who may be fearing that if they do run and are successful, that something like this might happen to them as well.
Right. I think about that as vindicating the democratic process from this pattern of weaponized accusation. The performative wokeness that we were talking about before is ultimately a threat, more or less, to anyone who would challenge power. And it's one thing for people to make accusations. And just to be clear, I'm not suing any of my accusers. And there are all, and I want to get back to whether or not their claims were made in good faith or bad faith, because we sort of brushed up against that and sort of slid past it. But I want to come back to it after just addressing the lawsuit. The entity I'm suing is a newspaper, because it's one thing for people to spread a bunch of lies. Journalists are supposed to look for facts and call back whistleblowers and cover evidence. So when you have journalists indulge rumors and suppress facts, they basically do to themselves what Donald Trump always accused them of. I mean, it's profoundly ironic to be trying to defend the press from itself. Ultimately, I mean, it reminds me of our relationship to democracy, and that all of us are trying to defend a democracy from itself as well. And in this context of the particular character assassination that I confronted, my critics knew from the outset that their claims were based on falsities, insofar as the person who had accused me, who they'd weaponized on the East Coast, she'd accused an 80-year-old grandmother in North Carolina of complicity in a murder with an entire network of people that I was supposedly part of. And this went back for years. And so I knew this person as someone who told a bunch of lies about a bunch of people. And I couldn't say that as a person accused, right? Because that's just prototypically the character they tried to paint me as. So I kept my elbows in. I just trusted the press. For the first week or two, I was unfazed. I was like, the facts are going to come out. This is all going to blow over. There's nothing to see here. And it turns out, even if you don't have any skeletons in your closet, enough partisan operatives armed with the press can hang a bunch of skeletons in your closet. And the lawsuit is an attempt to ensure that the press respects its own ethics and the public and the democratic process enough to check its facts. And particularly in the context of accusations of this sort, it's important to take time to investigate before publishing. There's a real lesson here. And I want to call out Akela Lacey at The Intercept, I don't understand how she's still a reporter. It boggles my mind, because the excuse for journalism, and I have respect for The Intercept's journalism, but in this case, we saw multiple whistleblowers suppressed. We saw a story revised 4 times that they couldn't get right, even after 3 subsequent revisions. And every subsequent revision issued in the dead of night, long after the publication of stories that were vicious in the first instance, indulging people who have been identified, people who've admitted their lies since, the worst of them. Yet still, these articles remain uncorrected and unfixed. And the phenomenon of people making accusations that are proven to be false, not to be called out. I mean, it's interesting, and I want to dig into The Intercept here. They had a September story walking back many of the elements of this hit piece that they published in July. And in September, the lead is ultimately that my campaign manager admitted that a written accusation of sexual assault was false, entirely fabricated. And somehow that shows up on like page 4 of an article
Of course.
that's presented in the headline is like progressives wrestle with how to deal with accusation instead of career operatives for the Democratic Party invent racist accusations to kneecap immigrant candidates. That's what happened here. And a bunch of groups got misled into doing that. And there was an attack on the voters of my district. And ultimately, that's why I'm suing the Chronicle, is to defend my district from racist election disinformation being printed by journalists who can't show up for their own basic, most, and I'm not asking for much here by way of press ethics, right? I'm not asking them to like bend over backward, but when you get a phone call from a whistleblower and there are a bunch of text messages on your desk showing that the people you're quoting on the record know that they're engaged in a smear campaign, those might be good things to tell the readers. But it's somehow, even still a year later, none of the journalists who covered this story at Mission Local, at the San Francisco Chronicle, at 48 Hills, at Broke Ass Stewart, at The Intercept, not a single one of them have corrected their stories to include the whistleblower who exposed all of their sources as lying career operatives serving the Democratic establishment. And I'm really eager for the record to remain corrected. And I do think that this is a reflection of a pattern that demands accountability. That's why I'm in court.
Ryan Grimm, if you're seeing this, just saying, we dealt with a couple of things. I would say the most glaring example was, I'm not going to name the person, doesn't matter, but a writer for the Miami Herald had interviewed Jen about, I want to say maybe a month and a half before the election, something around there, probably about that. And was basically about the fact that, Wasserman Schultz has a very checkered history of doing very unethical things, and one of them involved basically infringing Jen's name.
Yeah, she stole my name to go to her congressional webpage. It was ridiculous.
It was and it
was jenperlman.com, went right to Debbie Wasserman Schultz's congressional, not her campaign page, her official congressional page.
And as two attorneys here, you would know that her federal page, that's breaking the law.
Well, that's my representative. That's just creepy.
You can't do that. And so
that is absurd.
She took two of them. It was Jen Perlman for Congress and jenperlman.com. Both went to her congressional webpage. So we know this stuff.
Yeah, we were mentioned a couple of places. I'm pretty sure it was Lee Fong, if I remember correctly, who mentioned it in The Intercept.
But this is what they were trying to interview me about.
Yeah, but the person who was writing for the Miami Herald, it was initially supposed to be because of what Debbie had been doing, because this is a clear violation. Right. And instead of that, the person writes a story saying how Jen is not viable to beat Debbie. And it's just like, oh my God, like, why do you guys do this? And you wonder why they say fake news, and it's totally true. And that's the problem. You can
that viable word.
Yeah.
I can't stand it.
And as much as people like to make fun of Trump, yeah, he's a terrible messenger, but the message ain't wrong. And that's the problem.
Right. A lot of this is fake news. It just is. Well, it's just state-sanctioned propaganda.
It is. And of course, there is vested financial interest in Nancy Pelosi staying exactly where she is, just as there is vested financial interest in making sure somebody like Debbie Wasserman Schultz stays exactly where she is. And that's why they have to do things like this, because if you did have a debate with Nancy, it wouldn't go very well for her.
I think it would be glorious.
Well, I'm sure it would be.
I think I would find it, I would be happy.
But just as much as
the district deserves it, just to be clear, she hasn't debated anyone in 34 years.
Yeah.
So as glorious as you and I might find it, and just to be clear, I would love to have an opportunity to ask her a few questions. That notwithstanding, like taking all of us out of it, just as a mere like representation of democracy, if you don't have a congressional debate in a district for a generation, like what pretense?
We haven't had that.
Well, what's even more
we haven't had one here. I don't think ever.
Well, the two respective, I use that term loosely, but the two leaders of the two major parties in this country are both representatives from California. One of them is 55 and the other is 80. If that doesn't tell you kind of where the two parties are right now, you don't have to like Kevin McCarthy, but at least he is somewhat more adaptable to circumstance.
Not ancient.
And the reality is, it's not just Pelosi. It's Durbin. It's Hoyer. It's Clyburn. They're all over the age of 80. I mean, at some point, you have to say that they're really desperately trying to hang on to power. And if that's not enough, Feinstein's pushing 90. So at some point, you have to say, yeah,
give them the hook.
When's the dam going to break? And no matter how many of these smear stories they try to throw, it's at some point, somebody's got to make a stand and say, no, this is BS. You all need to know that it's BS, and not that there aren't circumstances that will happen from time to time. But overwhelmingly, when it happens like this, under these circumstances, it's being done for nefarious purposes. And so by you stepping forward and doing what you're doing, again, casting aside anything that one person's word against the other, and anybody who worked on their campaign may have had an issue, that's a separate issue.
Yeah.
But the fact that corporate media is running cover clearly for these entrenched establishment candidates, and there's nobody higher on the totem pole than Nancy Pelosi, it certainly speaks volumes as to the lengths that they will go in order to do that. Where does the case stand currently as of right now?
We're waiting to receive the other side's reply. So that'll happen. There will likely be an exchange of motions before we get to the merits. There are a couple of themes that you touched on. I want to just make sure we draw out. One of them, you were describing a sort of class analysis to describe the bias in the media and the predictable bias that we encounter from corporate press. And I'd remind us here of when Dr. King writes in his letter from Birmingham jail, he speaks of how we should expect the opposition of intransigent enemies, but it's our allies whose conspicuous absence proves both disappointing and what ultimately enables injustice to continue, right? And so here, it wasn't just the corporate press. I mean, I don't think of The Intercept as corporate press.
No.
I don't think of Mission Local and 48 Hills as corporate press. These are independent press outlets that are still serving the Democratic establishment and printing. Here's where I want to complicate the analysis. I don't think a class analysis suffices to explain it. It certainly explains the phenomenon of smear campaigns generally, but it's really hard for me to look past the ultimate and very unfortunate racialization that I encountered, or the homophobia that Alex Morris encountered, like the leveraging of identity by the Democratic establishment using the very same kind of like identity trope straight out of the most racist parts of our country is a part that we can't look past. And I think to try to reduce that to class does the issue a disservice. I want to particularly invite, because we're skipping over this piece, Gloria, can you talk about what you experienced? You talked a little bit about what you observed in terms of the accusations towards me, but what happened when you tried to raise your voice?
Well, I was naive in the beginning. I actually went to the clubs as an individual, had my 2-minute comment, and you can't even dig into this in 2 minutes, And I felt like, hey, if I let them know that I can counter this or that, or I was in that campaign office and I saw his campaign manager treat actually other people very toxic, including myself. She was very rude to me. She wouldn't let the volunteers pass out my campaign literature, although Shahid had endorsed me. You know how we combine campaigns into one bag. She wouldn't let me put my literature in one bag. And a commenter put that this is literally high school gossip drama. And it feels like that. It was very high school petty behavior. And it's the most frustrating part of it. And I kind of switching gears a little bit, but here in San Francisco, we have an ordinance called the Karen Act. And it's specifically for the white women falsely accusing Black and brown men of crimes, calling the police on them. So now in San Francisco, you can be fined for this type of behavior. So I, as a Democrat on the party here in San Francisco, I wrote a resolution in support of the Karen Act. But to tie it into Shahid, that's what it felt like. This one woman, his campaign manager, a white woman, this one other woman who tweeted from the East Coast somewhere that Shahid did something horrible to her. These two women, their word was enough. Emmett Till was murdered because of a white woman's lies and what she said in the statement. And this is disgusting to me, because they think, move on, the campaign season is over, but this is Shahid's life. Take politics out of it. You Google his name, this type of stuff pops up. You tweet his name, someone comes back and references these accusations. It's just not right.
Yeah.
I'm all for people being held accountable if they do bad things. And if I was in any way the character that I was constructed to be, first of all, I wouldn't have run in the first place. But secondly, you might think that somebody in the 20 years I've worked with would have had a similar experience, except for the handful of people who worked with me over a period of weeks and then who we replaced, right? And all of them had political critique. Several of them were appointed to the board of an organization that endorsed Pelosi. Several of them were appointed to assembly delegate positions by the person who's now the vice chair of the state party. So there were plenty of rewards handed out to the people who orchestrated this. And the conflicts of interest, the suppressed voices with the facts throughout all this, I'm sort of in the wake of all this, left as like one respect, you might think of me as like a bird with a broken wing, right? And on the other hand, I think my critics made the mistake of thinking me to be ultimately a political actor, because, their smears certainly made me unpopular in some circles. And I think by calling out the racism in the clubs that smeared me, I've probably, in fact, I'm sure I've made myself more unpopular in some of those local circles, but I don't frankly care. I don't seek what's popular. And that's what the particular thing I've grown to admire most about Gloria as well, is you can tell the difference between a truth teller and a politician, because some of us invite risks by what we say and other people seek favors by what they say. And, politicians do what's popular. I don't care what's popular. I'm not even interested in it. I just do what's right. And as more people figure out what the problems are, they've come to realize over the last 20 years, like, society's kind of bent into my lane. I mean, when I graduated from law school in 2003, the idea that I would ever run for Congress I would have laughed at it, right? I mean, I've always been on the left edge of any polite circle. So the idea that I could run for Congress is, it still frankly amazes me that society's bent to a point where enough people are like aware, where we can actually run campaigns that actually call out the obvious, that capitalism is going to kill humanity and life on earth if we don't restrain it, that universal healthcare is a basic human right enjoyed around the rest of the world. We in the United States should enjoy it too, that we have a predatory military industrial complex that's been plundering the planet for 70 years, depriving we, the people of the United States, of our most basic rights, and that we frankly don't have to take it anymore. We can bring that into the electoral sphere. It's amazing to me that, we're at that point now in our society. But again, I'm not running because I thought my positions would be popular. I'm running because they're the right positions for our civilization. And if people think that by making me unpopular, they're going to push me off the stage, I think they have another thing coming. And this is one reason why, frankly, I would take a bullet for Gloria Berry, because there are people who do say the truth, whatever the cost. And I think Ilhan Omar comes to mind as someone like that in Congress. She's been smeared the same way you have, Jen.
Oh yeah.
And she's done incredible work challenging the corruption there. And frankly, it doesn't surprise me that we who aspire to join their ranks face these kinds of smears, recognizing how much damage our allies have been able to do to a corrupt establishment just with the toehold that they've been able to get.